This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
You are in for an Uber treat today because I have Wernick and Mike Ward. They are both partners at Vinson Elkins, and we're going to dissect the three biggest enforcement actions in 2020. The Airbus case, J&F Investments, and Goldman Sachs. Fry's going to talk to us about it from the government/DOJ perspective, and Mike's going to take a look at it from the CCO, compliance practitioner perspective. It's a great episode. I know you'll enjoy it. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and today you are in for an uber-duber special treat because I have Wernick and Mike Ward, both partners at Vinson and Elkins, and we're going to do a podcast on something I've wanted to do with these gentlemen for quite some time, and that's take a look at the three of the largest anti-corruption cases this year and slice and dice it from a couple of different perspectives. One is to kind of ask Fry questions about the DOJ or government perspective. The second is to ask Mike from the company/CCO chair perspective. We're going to take a look at Airbus, J&F Investments, and Goldman Sachs. So, gentlemen, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you both for taking the time to visit with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Good to be back.
So we're going to start with Airbus, and we're going to start with you, Fry. The biggest case ever. Huge corruption scandals across the globe. We had France, we had the United Kingdom taking the lead, and then we had the FCPA unit and indeed other portions of the Department of Justice and U.S. government. So, Fry, what does all this mean for workload in the FCPA unit?
Well, it's a good question. The Airbus case was one that I supervised when I was at DOJ. So I'm going to, I'll limit specific answers to what we know publicly, and also, I can broadly speak about my experience internally without necessarily getting into anything that would reveal any internal communications from DOJ. But I think your question as it relates to workload, DOJ has significantly increased its resources and dedication to these anti-corruption matters and the FCPA matters over several years. Example, when I joined the unit back in 2014, there were 19 prosecutors, and when I left, there were 35, and I think that number's about what they still have at this point when I left a year and a half ago. They are, considerably more and better suited now to handle these cases, given the increased resources that have been dedicated to these cases. The Airbus case, what you can see is it was a significant commitment by the U.S. government to bring this case. On the press release, there were no less than 9 different prosecutors mentioned on the U.S. side alone who brought the case, both from the DOJ fraud section, from the National Security Division, who's tasked with prosecuting violations of the ITAR, and also from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., that teamed up and brought this case, and it was domiciled in out of the D.C. office. So it was a considerable effort, as you can tell, from that press release, and which is particularly significant given the fact that it was a case that it was brought in coordination with the authorities from the PNF in Paris and from the SFO in London. And they, too, from their press releases, you can see dedicated significant efforts as well. So in terms of workload, while DOJ in the U.S. had a smaller piece of a much larger $3 billion through $3.9 billion resolution, it was a significant effort all around. And even with that smaller share of the pie, took a considerable effort by the U.S. government.
Working with French prosecutors, working with any sort of investigation in France presents unique challenges. The French blocking statute is something that I think many Americans struggle with understanding. I was wondering if you could comment about what's it like at the prosecutor to prosecutor level to work with the French prosecutors or indeed others across the globe.
Well, the blocking statute in France is an unusual animal. I think it's something we struggle with on both the government side, but also now on the defense side, wanting to be cooperative with the U.S. government when you also have to navigate the blocking statute in France, or maybe it's the Swiss data privacy law, or just the GDPR more generally now, as it's really been developed in its most recent vintage. So it is a unique challenge dealing in the French context, and I think from the government side, there's a great deal of trust that needs to be built up between the government prosecutors in the U.S. and the French counterparts, primarily because they're relatively new to bringing these types of enforcement actions, and they I think that it may be more largely driven by the Ministry of Justice in France than necessarily by the French prosecutors themselves, but there is I think there's a tendency to be protective of French companies from the long arm of the U.S. law, and I understand that perspective. If this, we're talking about Airbus here, which is a quintessentially European company. I also had handled the Rolls-Royce matter on behalf of DOJ, where you're dealing with what was then a quintessentially British company, and other countries are going to want primacy. They're going to want to take the first crack and not look like they have to leave corruption enforcement to the authorities in the United States to handle cases that they have the ability to investigate. I think from the Department of Justice perspective, there's an understanding as well that that's in the best interest of the U.S. as well, not to be the world's police, and when it can, to defer those actions to foreign authorities who are most capable of bringing them. I think what you've seen from France now in the last several years is a renewed, or not renewed, but frankly for the first time, priority to bring these types of cases. And as that happens, I think you see Airbus is a very good example of a willingness on the part of the U.S. to step back and take a lesser role when you have interested authorities in other countries willing to do so.
I can remember at the ACI National FCPA conference several years ago when Kara Brockmeyer and Dan Kahn first talked about publicly the one pie policy. That later became the anti-piling on policy. It became a policy to coordinate settlements both inside the United States and literally across the globe. But I always go back to that one pie because that for me is the best visual I can think of the split up of penalties. Could you give a few words on how the DOJ, the process the DOJ thinks or goes through to work out financial settlements with other countries, rather?
Well, look, you could spend an hour on that topic alone, and I'll do my best to condense it, because I think where it comes down to is the U.S. government is going, has broad reach, maybe. It has very broad reach in terms of enforcement of the FCPA and its money laundering statutes. And they are going to, my experience is the government is going to try to extend it as far as they can. Where I was saying earlier is when you see now, this huge trend towards global resolutions, and we're going to talk about all three of these, have foreign enforcement authorities actively engaged now. What you've seen, I think, is the appropriate recognition on the part of the United States to say we want to encourage foreign enforcement of these anti-bribery laws. It's what we've been saying in international fora like the UN Convention Against Corruption, like the OECD now for decades, is the more other countries will stand up their enforcement regimes, the Department of Justice and the SEC are going to be willing to step back a bit. And let them, do what is, frankly, from the U.S. government's perspective, should be done by these other countries. So I think there's going to be, that recognition factors in heavily into this one pie idea or this anti-piling on idea. As other countries build up and step up their enforcement, the U.S. Is going to be more willing now to step back. How that equates in practice is if you have a good working relationship on the part of the U.S. government and the foreign authorities, then they're going to sell the idea that, hey, we know how this process works. And I know this because this is frankly conversations I've had frequently. We can walk you through the process of bringing a case and getting to a resolution with a company, bringing charges against individuals, and equitably share it. But we need you to put in the sweat equity as well. We need you to actually investigate. We need you to share information. We need you to cooperate. And when we get there, at the end of the day, you will be handsomely compensated by getting an extraordinary amount of credit, and the U.S. government will then defer and credit significant sums. And so, in a case like Airbus here, you saw France and the UK getting 90% of the resolution, and frankly getting and handling 90% of the conduct, whereas the U.S. conduct ultimately was much more limited. Sometimes it'll be coextensive, where the conduct under investigation by all the entities is easily is handled kind of in parallel. It covers the same type of conduct, and then can be equitably distributed based on conversations that happen over periods of months and years between the entities. And much of this also, on the defense side now, it's something you really have to think through. The idea of trying to get all of the conduct covered. If you're at a situation where you're going to have a resolution with the government, positioning your company in a way that there's no pieces left unaccounted for by the time you resolve with the U.S., with the foreign authority. Because now we've seen over a period of years where the government is really interested and able to not pile on. This is a policy they're taking very seriously, and that they think, as a practitioner now advising my clients on the defense side, you want to get your arms around all the possible entities you can and have them in the conversation as early as you can if you see that it is likely to result in a resolution. So I think this is the reality we're working with now, where, if the government in the U.S., the DOJ and the SEC have partners that they can work with, that can be very beneficial in terms of wrapping everything up neatly for a company that unfortunately finds itself in a position where they have to resolve.
Mike, if I could turn to you now, one of the, I guess probably the single biggest question I get for Airbus specifically in large cases is, how does this apply to me? I read the deferred prosecution agreement, I read the information or what other documents are available, and I just can't really understand and even explain to my board, what does a case so massive, what does it mean to me? And what are your thoughts on how someone sitting in the CCO chair can digest these and then really put some actionable lessons learned or bullet points for a board or senior management together?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question that compliance officers consistently review with themselves, with their teams, with their boards when a big resolution comes out, because a compliance officer really, he has multiple roles, but from this perspective, you may be reacting to an allegation and you may be in investigation resolution mode, in which case issues like the piling on policy and blocking statutes are of vital importance to you. But when you're not in that mode, when you're not actively defending an investigation or an issue, what your focus is on, what are the actionable insights from this resolution that will influence how I structure my program? That is, what does it tell me that I can take actions proactively that will position me better? And I think most compliance officers out there unless they're blessed with some active investigation, have that lens when they hear about these investigations. And it's what I did, and what I would advise compliance officers is you should do this yourself, or even better yet, assign this task to one of the junior people on your team. That every time an FCPA resolution comes out, they will, especially a junior person, have them analyze this outcome. And I used to go through these questions every time and ask myself, what was the scheme here? How did this bribery scheme work? Who was the government official who was involved? What was the decision-making authority that they have? What was the what was the MO of the offense here? And then, is that analogous to my business? Is it in my industry? Or is it analogous to my industry? And these types of questions are, can it happen to me? What would my controls be if this happened? Kind of like take the scenario and turn it on yourself and say, how prepared am I for this? And then the second part of that equation or that analysis would be, what controls were discussed in the resolution that were either criticized explicitly or implicitly, maybe even what controls were encouraged, or what did the resolution favorably recognize? All the rage now is data analytics. Like you don't see many criticisms of data analytics, but you see lots of favorable mentions. Like what does this resolution tell me about what controls I currently have or could put in place? And then, thirdly, what was rewarded in the resolution? What is it in the compliance program that was rewarded or punished or viewed to be inadequate? Was there some sort of structure or reporting relationship? Kind of, what was the structure of the program and any gaps that were observed or missed? And I would use that lens every time. And then if there was a meaningful takeaway for our board or senior management, you'd use that. At a minimum, a lot of these resolutions are very colorful. There might be some recitations of some emails that will resonate with your people, and you want to, use these real examples, fresh examples in your training, in your messaging, rather than using the stale, Jack and Jill went up the hill kind of compliance training that we often pull together. So when I apply that lens to Airbus, the first thing that kind of jumped out for me was there were a number of examples of what I would call compliance officer capture, where the compliance officers were really not exercising their independence. There was one instance where the compliance officer was encouraged or maybe volunteered to change the meeting minutes for one of the third-party review committees, where there's some question about what was the purpose of this third party. And because the facts didn't, reconcile with what had happened, there actually was an instance where the minutes were revised. And that's always a bad fact. Another thing from the Airbus case that I've been watching as a trend in some other cases is I noticed that despite the pervasive levels of fraud and corruption that were uncovered around the globe, and a lot of different breakdowns in retention of third parties and entertainment, discounting, like this case has a lot of different things going on. It wasn't just one particular scheme or control breakdown. But despite the pervasiveness of that, there was no monitor that was imposed. And as a compliance person, I still identify with that as an identity, even though a partner at Vinson Elkins now, and been a compliance officer for more than a decade and a half. The thing that you're most concerned about or you're very frightened about is like, oh my gosh, we don't want to have an external compliance officer come here and try to learn how a compliance program is supposed to operate while they're driving our car around. Like that's a recipe for frustration. So this monitor issue is something that compliance officers and management teams focus on. And there was no monitor imposed here. And there are a couple of observations I would make about that. First, it seems surprising given the prevalence of the misconduct and the duration of it. Second thing I would observe is that I think Airbus had engaged a panel of 3 compliance experts as external advisors to the organization. So, in effect, they engaged in I don't know if they would call this that, but a self-monitoring arrangement where they, instead of waiting for the end of the resolution of the case, they had proactively engaged these compliance experts to help them in their reforming their compliance program. And I think that has a number of virtues to it for me as a former compliance officer, and for those current compliance officers out there, that when you do find yourself in this situation where you've had an issue and you're trying to get your arms around what the problems are, you don't delay or defer the remediation of that until the end of the case. That's kind of old school investigation resolution. And I speak from being a longtime federal prosecutor too. Like, that was the way we always did things, is you would investigate and you figure out what happened, and then at the end of the whodunit stage, now there would be discussion about, okay, what are we going to do about it? And now I think you'll see prudent companies and good defense counsel are moving that conversation way up in the discussion. And the old school argument would be, oh, we need to be very careful about remediating anything. We learned that in law school, right? If you go put non-skid stickers in the lobby of the movie theater, that's an admission that it must have been a dangerous condition. And I think that kind of defensive thinking is outmoded probably for movie theater lobbies, but it definitely is for compliance programs, where you need to attack your problems proactively, and then by the time the resolution discussion comes about, you have a real compelling story to tell about what the root causes were, and that you as an organization have addressed those. That helps demonstrate the good faith of the organization, but it also helps head off this boogeyman of a monitor. Like, we know how to self-govern, and we identified the problem and we fixed it. And I think on all those scores, it's really the right way to go. I would say one last thing. It's not really in this resolution, but when we talk about Airbus, it reminds me of I believe it is the Airbus chief compliance officer now, who's actually on the board of Siemens. And I think that is also an interesting trend to watch out for, because I think with some of the recent Delaware cases about compliance program oversight and encouraging boards to ask whether they've got the appropriate compliance expertise on your board, the notion of a compliance officer, an experienced compliance officer, being a member of a board also positions that company not only for better compliance performance, but from a corporate governance standpoint, I think it sends the right message as well.
And I would just jump in two things, little practice tips. And, Mike has incredible experience in-house at so many different companies and handling compliance and really getting, companies' compliance programs up to speed. It's been a really incredibly educational working alongside him now at V&E. When you are, he's talking about tasking people with every resolution. I would imagine most of your listeners are already doing this, I would hope. But, you look at section 4 of every DPA and it's going to talk about the relevant factors. And if you will see over the years, DOJ has gotten so much better at really outlining all of the factors that went into what it, how it considered the case, what was important, what remediation occurred, what kind of root cause analyses occurred, that then factored into the final resolution. On the plea agreements, I think it's usually about the 7th paragraph, where there's a similar type of analysis that takes place where they're informing the court why it is that they felt this was a reasonable agreement to justify an 11C plea agreement. So there really are guideposts out there to help people understand what happened, where were the compliance failures, and what had been done about it. And to Mike's last point, there's been a real push at DOJ since before I left and since I left to take a closer view of monitors and when it is appropriate to bring a monitor and what are companies doing to put themselves in the best position to avoid a monitor. And getting out in front of that discussion, not waiting until you're in front of DOJ or SEC and in the middle of a Philip Factors or Seaboard presentation, but actually, in the years before and in the months before, getting and being proactive about that so that you're best positioned to defend your program and that you've conducted that root cause analysis, that you've fixed all of the possible problems that there are. That's the best way to avoid that monitor, because ultimately, really, it comes down to what is the state of your current program now? What remediation have you done so that the DOJ and the SEC can be comfortable that this problem has been fixed and won't occur again?
The thing that Fry just mentioned there is kind of like a critical thing is you need to work backward from that presentation. And the question is, does this company understand what the problems were and have they fixed them? And can they convince us that they fixed them? And so to go backward, in order to present persuasive evidence in that presentation, which only maybe lasts 90 minutes, it's not something you can write that deck in the week or month beforehand and say, oh, here, we've got it. We've come up with a really good compliance presentation. In order to make a very compelling presentation, that'll take 18 months. Because what you need to do is you need to put those controls in place a year or more before, and then let the evidence collect that you've effectively remediated the program, show through data and evidence that this control is working. You can't put that control in place 2 weeks before the presentation and say, oh, we fixed it. Everything is good here. Nothing to see. You need to think, when that day comes, what compelling evidence will we want to be able to muster that will convince them we've got the right thing? And that takes a while. So that's another reason why you need to jump on that as soon as possible. And investigations as it's unfolding, yes, additional facts can come out, but as soon as issues and themes start emerging, you need to start fixing them as soon as possible and building your case.
Gentlemen, I'd now like to turn to the J&F Investments case. And Fry, I'm going to start with you. This one was, for me, a little bit unusual because it spun out of the JBF settlement in Brazil. 2 years later, we had an FCPA enforcement action. So I wanted to start with your thoughts on, is this unusual? What's it like working with Brazilian prosecutors? My sense is that there was a good relationship between the FCPA unit and the Brazilian prosecutors. And how do you handle what I might call a spin-off prosecution? You might call it just a regular prosecution.
This is somewhat unusual, maybe in modern FCPA enforcement, that you have it less, a resolution like this happening, not happening on the same day. In this case, separated by over a year, I believe, almost 2 years. But it's not unprecedented, and it's not even unprecedented in among U.S. agencies. And I think we saw the Beam resolution earlier this year, where DOJ and the SEC resolved on different dates, really about the same conduct. So, these two cases are, you can see there's obvious overlap between the Brazilian prosecutors and their treatment of the case, and then it occurring a little bit later in the U.S. I think partly that may be able to be chalked up to the fact that, this anti-corruption enforcement, Brazil has really done a phenomenal job in how they've stood up a enforcement regime almost overnight over the last few years, and brought so many significant cases here. But at the same time, DOJ and the SEC are going to be working potentially more methodically in when they bring their cases, and there is a system to it, and I don't have any inside intel on, and nor would I be able to share it if I did know why this one particularly was separated the way it was. But I think what you do see is a more of the common thread that we've seen now over the last several years of a very strong working relationship between the Brazilians and DOJ. It is something that If you had to choose, and I think you've heard DOJ people say this publicly, their strongest relationship it really could be with the Brazilians right now in terms of sharing information. And it is done informally, partly because it's been a work in progress in Brazil and how they handle it. I think there's always going to be encouragement by the U.S. government, particularly DOJ, with their foreign counterparts that things can be done informally. Sharing of information can be done informally to help build cases. And sometimes that has been more of a struggle with the European counterparts to get sign off to informal information sharing the way you see in Brazil. And so it's, it doesn't surprise me that you'd then see this type of case, even if it was a bit surprising that it wasn't aligned to take place at the exact same time. But again, it's just the latest example of one of these cases that began in Brazil and then ended up with a very large resolution in the U.S. as well.
Mike, if I could turn to you now, this case to me presented some of the most unique facts I've seen in an FCPA enforcement action. We had a purchase out of bankruptcy by J&F U.S. of Pilgrim's Pride. So that was kind of an interesting point, number one. But number two is it really led to me to wonder what's the responsibility in the M&A situation of the acquired entity, the target. We talk about M&A in terms of the context of the acquirer, certainly doing pre-acquisition due diligence and a wide variety of other activities. But now we have questions around the target. So how would you as a compliance officer think about some of these lessons? And then maybe how would you think about investigating a parent if that situation arose or you received information along those lines?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's kind of an unusual situation, and it's one that's not really because of corporate governance and control provisions. It's not one that's going to be easily remedied. It's not very often, if ever, that a subsidiary is going to be able to say, we're going to be conducting due diligence on you, and we want to perform investigation of you. Now, there are situations like in a government contracting situation where a U.S. sub is set up to allow U.S. federal contracting entitlements or contracts and security agreements may require that standalone independence, and so there's a little bit of latitude and influence built in for the subsidiary to push back against a foreign-owned subsidiary. But those are very unusual. I think the takeaways for me from this matter are certainly, as you point out, the M&A transactional due diligence issues, just putting aside the minority control versus the acquired versus acquiring entity. The M&A due diligence issues, you need a good procedure set up, and you need to follow through, but the risks are somewhat bespoke, and they're not so amenable to standardized controls as much as having a checklist and well-trained, astute people operating the due diligence process and asking the right questions and persisting in getting answers to those questions. So it certainly reinforces that. The other takeaway I have on this matter, I mean, this is not an operating company issue in my view, and so to a large degree, I think the analysis that I described before is less informative for the JBS matter. So I kind of look at it from the standpoint of, my gosh, it just shows you what deep pockets will get. This is one of the largest resolutions in FCPA history, and it's really a testament to the deep pockets. The next takeaway I have from this is kind of a bit of a mantra that I've followed for a long time, and that is, as it pertains to government enforcement agencies and officials. And I even refer to myself, like when I used to go around giving speeches as a member of the U.S. Department of Justice and telling people what to look out for and what to do. And that mantra goes like this, like, pay attention to what they do, not just what they say. And what that means is, in this case, you notice that despite this massive settlement and seemingly strong evidence of corruption, there was absolutely no individual criminal liability here. Like, so we hear the department, and it is certainly, I think, expressed in good faith, saying we want to prosecute more individuals. Individual accountability is what matters, and I can tell you it does, but it's really hard to do. And it's just one example of how it's easy to say this is our policy imperative and initiative, but sometimes those things are really difficult to follow through on. So when you're shaping your compliance program and your compliance program investments, I think it's good to look through where has the department's emphasis really been, what actions have they tended to take, and what have they not taken, and that often tells you a very different story than what the public comments will of the enforcement officials, which are made in the utmost good faith, but it just shows there's a delta between what you'd like to do and what you actually can do because of the challenges of enforcement or availability of evidence.
All right, gentlemen, now let's turn to Goldman Sachs, largest FCPA settlement of all time, multinational, literally across the globe. And Fry, I wanted to maybe start with you to just give us some idea of how the department would work up a case such as this. How many prosecutors would work on it? How would the supervisor or the lead really coordinate everything? Because you had multiple violations, not only across the globe, but also in the United States of various laws. So could you help us think about how you would think about organizing something like this?
Yeah, and this is a case that involved multiple officers and multiple aspects. You had, ultimately, if you look at the court filings, what began as a civil case, a forfeiture case out in the Central District of California. And again, another case where, I supervise on the fraud section DOJ, and we were just one of several entities involved. You had the fraud section in the criminal division, the money laundering section in the criminal division. You had the Central District of California early on in the civil case, and then Eastern District of New York, who has become with more frequency a partner of the fraud section in bringing these FCPA cases. So you have multiple prosecutors involved at different levels. And, the question of who ends up being on that team is largely driven by venue, right? And DOJ taking an aggressive position on how it can bring cases based on the flow of money into both SDNY and EDNY. Here you had a property in California and other conduct occurring there that lends itself to venue potentially there as well. So that's one area of which U.S. Attorney's Office gets involved. The cases begin from a number of sources, right? You're putting aside the voluntary disclosures, which I think these days are about a quarter to a fifth of the cases DOJ investigates. Whistleblowers, you've got investigative media, you've got other types of foreign sources, foreign counterparts bringing cases to their attention. And then, law enforcement officers actually going around and developing sources and leads. So however that actually comes in, when you're looking for venue, the U.S. Attorney's Office to team up with, and which sections within the Department of Justice would be involved. This, ultimately is an FCPA matter, but the money laundering section contributed heavily, as you could see in the press releases and in their filings. And like any case now, what you deal with is where was the conduct occurring, and do you have foreign authorities that you can do it? Here you've got foreign authorities, ultimately, a big resolution in Malaysia. You have authority in Singapore, and here with a bank that's highly regulated by other entities, both in the New York and federally. So the Fed, Reserve, the New York Department of Financial Services, other entities that would want to be actively involved. And so, as you rightly imagine, that can be a logistical headache in how to arrange this, how to deconflict among the government entities. And frankly, if I'm putting on my current hat, how do you, as a attorney helping a client, manage all of the various regulators? And I have to do this on multiple cases now with other highly regulated companies. Managing all the different work streams that are coming at you at the same time, oftentimes it might relate to the very same set of facts. And so we touched on earlier the anti-piling on aspect of this, and that's highly relevant. And it's highly relevant in kind of managing the information flow, respecting each of the sovereign entities and each of the governmental regulators' respective interests in this, and not discounting that in any way. But needing to create a way to streamline information flow back and forth and responsiveness to various requests. So, on both sides, both as a prosecutor, that's important because you don't want to do anything. First, frankly, if you're a DOJ prosecutor, as I used to be, you don't want others to do anything that might impact your investigation unwittingly, both from domestic enforcement agents to foreign authorities. On the defense side, you're also highly cognizant of the fact that your cooperation with one set of authorities could impact your cooperation with others. And so you need to find ways to balance that and to hope that the governments are talking to each other, so that you're not doing anything that could be seen as a mistake by one or the other. But yet, the one side wants, but the other side ultimately finds that they would not have wanted to occur. So it's a very difficult balancing act, but one that has to be handled deftly. And this was, you said, this is a huge, large case. I think I wanted to touch on something Mike said earlier. There is this incredible effort to bring cases against individuals, which is the biggest deterrent. And, that was a sea shift in the way these cases were viewed in my period at DOJ. When I started, I often felt that we were getting the cart before the horse, looking at the companies, and when really the best way to bring those cases was to go after the individuals. And once you have individual culpability, the case against their entity, their employer, becomes so much easier to bring, and it puts the government in such a stronger negotiating position. What you see here in this, the Goldman resolution, is the government in a very, very strong position once they have a plea agreement in place with a cooperating witness, like they did with Tim Leissner. So, that there are other charges that have been brought against Joe Lowe and Roger Ung still pending, and there's a trial pending against Ung. But the fact that they were able to bring have a plea deal where somebody is admitting to conduct within the scope of their authority on behalf of a bank, you can imagine makes it puts them in a stronger negotiating position with an entity than they would have without such a plea deal in place. And that's just, the nature of criminal corporate responsibility in America right now, given the current state of the law. So, once that sea shift happened at DOJ, I think they've been able to bring better and stronger cases because they really have been focusing on bringing cases against individuals. And I'll tell you one thing that I think, though, should be more emphasized by those of us in the defense bar. One of the Philip factors is the adequacy of enforcement against individuals, and whether that alone should be a more significant factor when determining what to do with companies. Because in the instances where there only are one or two or a handful of people, and there are strong cases to be made about whether internal controls were circumvented, I think it would be helpful to remind the government of the fact that in those types of cases, justice does not necessarily demand a huge corporate fine or corporate resolution. So if you can position yourself as a company to really say, look, we have helped you bring a case against individuals. That individual was working in a very small subgroup. It really justice is not served by just getting your pound of flesh against the company as well. And I think that's something that would be worth revisiting with the government more frequently. And it shouldn't just be a fait accompli that a corporate settlement must always follow.
Mike, if I could turn to you now, and once again, we have a massive case with settlements, I think, with 8 different enforcement agencies across the globe, largest FCPA case, multiple acts, both money laundering, bribery, and corruption. Once again, how do you think through the application of the Goldman case to your company, you as the CCO? You've kind of walked us through the process you use to analyze, but does that work with something that's not only massive in terms of dollars, but also massive in terms of number of enforcement agencies and different violations of different laws across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are not many businesses across the globe that are analogous in size and scope and the offense conduct here in this Goldman Sachs matter. So if you looked at it too precisely, you'd say, well, not many insights from there. But I look at this case and I think it's loaded with valuable, actionable takeaways. So, we've talked a little bit about monitors, but I think, again, this is a case that you have to look at it and say, well, there's this pervasive corruption scheme, the largest settlement in history, and there's no monitor. And it's true, even though Goldman Sachs had a resolution, I guess you call it a resolution earlier this year, where they received a complete declination, both from DOJ and SEC, involving one of their investment bankers trying to arrange a corruption scheme in Africa. So they're not only a multiple offender, but just this year they've had some real serious issues and no monitor. And I think the reason for that is they've got a phenomenal compliance program. In my time as a compliance officer, I've done some benchmarking with the folks at Goldman, and I was just incredibly impressed. The specific subject was on data analytics, and I can't think of a more sophisticated program, not only because of the capability of their team, but they have a very data-rich environment as a regulated institution. They, of course, it's clear from the resolution documents, they tape record phone calls, so the amount of data that they have about their people is a data-rich environment. They have a lot of information to work with, and they do a lot with it. But I think there are some interesting takeaways for any line of business. And so one of the first I would point out to compliance officers, general counsel, is that this case is a good illustration of you in the compliance program. You have to not only be right just once, but you need to be always right or persistently right. This was a case where the compliance program very effectively shut the door on these corrupt third parties through their know your customer procedures. They identified that Lowe was not somebody they wanted to do business with, and they very emphatically slammed the door. And yet the perpetrators here within Goldman kept knocking on the door, and they kept trying to get this guy back in. And eventually, when somebody on the compliance team let down their guard for a moment, and the bank started doing business with this guy. And you can all think of it, you should think of that in your own company, is like, do we have controls that are persistent? That is, when we turn down this gift and hospitality proposal, how do we know that that is going to persist and that it's not going to be submitted again next week by a different employee describing it differently, and it gets approved by somebody else without knowing that this advice or decision had been taken? Is this third party they've tried to get in and we've rejected, do we have a persistent process to make sure that they stay out? Or once they've been in and we've kicked them out because of an audit or whatever, is our system persistent and making sure that those decisions stay or those actions are memorialized, and that the information and the decisions we've taken are available to other people on the team. So there's a great question there that involves prior investigations, audit work, disciplinary action. Like there's this saying, if we only knew what we know, we would really be dangerous. And it's kind of like, we've got all this information within the organization. Can we bring it to bear when we need to? Because if the government finds that you had the information over here and you didn't connect this dot with that dot, like they expect, I think, unfairly, substantial omniscience, that you can connect all those dots and that you be held accountable. The next thing I think that I pointed out is that the company here had a process where they asked the right questions. They asked of the business, why do you want to do business with this particular customer? And they received representations that said, X, Y, and Z. And in the settlement documents, it questions or kind of criticized the compliance function's failure to conduct independent investigation to verify or corroborate or disprove these representations that were made that later turned out to have been false. And to me, that kind of language sends a chill down my spine as a compliance officer, because systems are set up to rely on internal representations. We ask questions about, what is the proposed compensation for this third party? How do you want to use them? What's their record? This is the way it works. And there's never an assumption that you're going to be lied to consistently. And the notion that without a red flag or some sort of suggestion that what you're being told is not true needs to be independently investigated by the compliance function, I think is hopefully a point that kind of leaks into these documents that isn't going to be carried forward. I think that it will be kind of backbreaking for compliance programs to have to interpret this settlement as requiring that kind of independent verification in the absence of a internal contradiction or red flag. The other thing I think is really interesting I think it came out of the Hong Kong resolution rather than the U.S. DOJ or SEC settlement documents, but there's this. I think we tend to think about compliance red flags as being separate from commercial red flags, and this. Really, I think there was an example in this case that kind of shows that they're really one and the same. And when a deal doesn't make sense commercially, that is a compliance red flag. And it also means that you need to know your business or you're not going to be able to spot the red flag. And the fact that I'm talking about is, I think in the Hong Kong resolution, they said that one of the deals that was approved here, the margin, the profit on the deal was orders of magnitude, like 3 times or something like that, more profitable than any of, if it's a 5 times more profitable than any of the hundreds of deals they had done in Southeast Asia for the previous 5 years. And there was no explanation of why would that be? And there was no question about why would that be. Like when a deal sticks out from a commercial perspective in that kind of dramatic way, that is something that you should ask of your own team. Like, do we have visibility into that? Do we understand the commercial premise on which this deal is being constructed? And if we don't have either the information to judge this deal or the context or framework with which to make a judgment about that, we could be second-guessed in the same way.
If I can just jump in, and this, by the way, I said it earlier, but having Mike as a colleague here has been so great. And I listen to you really parse documents that you're reviewing from the outside and really gathering so much intel. I think has been useful. But you hit the nail on the head on really, what the takeaways could be from this case from our perspective now on what you learn, lessons learned from this case. Going back just for a second, you talked about, Mike had mentioned why no monitor? And of course, that's a big question. And a lot of this has to deal with a shift, even if it's somewhat at the margins, and how the government's supposed to approach these cases, and really just reminding a kind of refocusing on what should matter when you make the decision of whether you have a monitor. And Mike, you talked about the earlier case that came out against a Goldman employee this year, Burko, the SEC. And what was notable there, though, was that conduct had been flagged by the compliance department at the bank. And, Charles Kane, the chief of the SEC's FCPA unit, made a statement. And I pulled it up while we were talking. But, if you look at the press release, went out of his way to say the firm's compliance personnel took appropriate steps to prevent the firm from participating in the transaction and is not being charged. Really, a noteworthy statement to suggest there's a carrot and a stick here for compliance professionals. And I think, that coupled with all the other things that Mike pointed to, I think fully justify the decision not to pursue a monitor or one on the bank here. Given, these are very good factors at play, and that the government appropriately considered when it made the ultimate decision here, notwithstanding the very large resolution. But I think people too often get caught up in the numbers. That's not what drives that decision, right? Those numbers are supposed to be fairly methodically deployed based on a true and faithful application of the U.S. sentencing guidelines in Chapter 8 as it relates to companies and enforcement and business organizations. So that really needs to be a distinct and should be a distinct consideration from the monitor question. And it seems that it very much was, and it was appropriately handled in this case.
Yeah, I think there are two last things that are kind of interesting about Goldman. One is that's already happened, and one that might happen. The one that's already happened is that they undertook some very aggressive clawbacks. I'll call them very aggressive. Maybe in the grand scheme of how much money these guys make, it's not that much. But they did claw back a lot of compensation against senior executives, including C-suite folks, former CEO, current CEO. It took a hit, and I think that's a great practice. I don't want to diminish the motivation behind it, but I think it's really shrewd as well. It's really smart for that board to have done that, to show that senior management is being held accountable, because, as we alluded to earlier, there is evidence in Delaware corporate governance law that the boards are beginning to be held more accountable under the long dormant Caremark standard to exercise that compliance oversight. And I think if you look at the Wells Fargo resolution, where I think it was 4 board members were knocked off the board by the Federal Reserve because of their lapses in overseeing compliance and risk management at Wells Fargo, I think boards, and especially those of financial institutions, need to be thinking about, is this accountability wheel going to be turning toward me eventually? It's kind of been climbing the ladder, and I think a smart board is also now thinking about, what do we need to do to make sure that our compliance program is being run correctly? And I think it is interesting. There is now, unpredictably, an alignment between the guidance that the Department of Justice is giving and that which Delaware courts are giving, which is, like, they're both saying you need to have a risk assessment process. If you don't have a reliable way to identify what your mission critical compliance risks are so you can address them proactively, you've got a gap. And that's true from the Department of Justice program evaluation guidance and from the Marchand and other recent governance cases. Both are also saying you need to have some predictability in terms of what issues are brought before the board. And I think that means you need a mandatory escalation policy. You need to define with some predictability, these are the issues that we expect to hear about when they come up. And if we're not hearing about them, we're going to take that as a representation that they're not arising, because we don't want you to be making ad hoc decisions about what's board appropriate. Like, let's be really clear about what comes to the board. And then the final thing, which is less clear from the DOJ, but I think it's good practice, is there needs to be an ethics and compliance program charter. The board and management, in particular the compliance management, need to lay out with some specificity in writing, here is how we are going to discharge our ethics and compliance obligations. Here's who's going to be accountable for what. Here's what expectations we have with respect to that. And then you could even incorporate that escalation policy into that charter so that the board can demonstrate that it has discharged its fiduciary duties by being clear with management about what is expensive management. I think that's one of the things that maybe the Goldman board was thinking about when they're thinking, oh, let's not be like that Wells Fargo board. Let's show a little bit of proactive accountability and hold senior management accountable, even though they weren't directly implicated in the misconduct. We want to show that we're not asleep at the switch.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but this has just been a fascinating episode. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me on this, and I hope that I can call upon one or both of you all again when our next series of the Big Three come up.
I'd love that, Tom.
Yeah, it was our pleasure. Thanks a lot for having us.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I'm pleased to announce that the latest podcast series in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Wirecard Saga, has premiered. Originally, it was on the FCPA Compliance Report, but due to its popularity, I have rolled it into its own podcast series. Subscribe to it on the Compliance Podcast Network. It will be out on iTunes the first week in December, so subscribe to the iTunes version of the Wirecard Saga. We're going to take this as long as we can. I know you'll enjoy it. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio.